there is a very good study that looked at over 116 countries over a 25-year range, looking at what were the practices introduced that did the most to address hunger, since hunger is basically what we're talking about here. And out of that study, they found that the number one measure was water and sanitation. It wasn't miracle seeds, fertilizer, anything like that. The number one was water and sanitation, people having access to good water and good sanitation. And the second one was female empowerment. And both of those are social entities, that needed to be provided by local governments or local institutions. So why are we spending so much money on miracle seeds when actually the solutions are somewhere else?
Welcome to the Real Organic Podcast. I'm Linley Dixon, co-director of the Real Organic Project. We're a grassroots, farmer-led movement with an add-on organic food label to distinguish organic crops grown in healthy soils and organic livestock raised on well-managed pasture. If you're a regular listener, you may have noticed that we're putting out our show on a Thursday. That's a new schedule for us, so Thursdays are now the days to look forward to our podcast release. You just heard from Barbara Gemmill-Herren. She's well known globally for her work at the FAO, which is the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. She's known both as a pollination project specialist and an agroecology program specialist. And in these roles, she's pushed for true cost accounting and the need for improved social policies to create a better food system. Barbara and Dave discussed all of these ideas and more when they sat down this past January. Barbara, along with her husband Hans, were both featured in the second session of our 2024 symposium, In Defense of Biology. There, they discussed their work in biocontrol, among other things. Tickets are still available to watch the recordings if you missed it, and you can watch the preview and find out all the details by visiting realorganicproject.org.
Welcome to the Real Organic Podcast. I am talking today with Barbara Gemmill-Herren. Hi, Barbara. You have a lot of stuff that we'll put into the program notes that you've done, really an amazing career, but I'm just going to shorten it to say that you still teach at Prescott College down in Arizona. My cousin was involved with founding Prescott College.
Oh, really?
Long time ago.
Oh, really? In the 60s.
Yeah. And you had a career for the FAO at the UN and lots of other stuff. So I want, tell me about how you came to agriculture.
Okay.
Right, yeah. We'll start there.
Okay. So I'm an ecologist. I really am more of an ecologist than an agriculturalist. And I did my PhD at Davis. I went to Berkeley first and have a degree in forestry and range management. So always looking at the practical side of natural resources and nature. And then I did my PhD at Davis. And during that time, then we had moved to Africa. So I focused on an ecology sort of focus on ecology and forestry, looking at how farmers have practices to conserve the forest when they need to clear it for agriculture. And we were on a research station. We were talking earlier about these big CG agricultural research stations. At that time, they believed that you need to use tractors and tree pushers and go and clear cut the forest. And the farmers themselves were really conserving certain trees to allow the forest to grow back quickly with the fallow. So I was documenting the regrowth and the yields during that time. And it was, compared to this multi-million-dollar project to clear the forest, what the farmers were doing made a lot of sense, and we could show that. So, but subsequent to that, then forestry research takes years. You really have to be in it for the long haul. And I became really interested in pollination as an ecological process that's really important to natural resource management. And it's right there in front of you. You can just see it happening, and it's so interesting. So I got very interested in it. And at the time, we were living in Kenya. I'd finished my PhD. And I started I had an appointment at University of Nairobi, and working with postgraduate students on pollination. I could raise some funds for research. and looking at both in the dry land, the rangeland, and in the agricultural area. Again, sort of similar, where there's an area of Kenya near to Nairobi where the farmers they're kind of under a lot of pressure to clear cut these riverine forests because they can grow a lot of vegetables for export to the UK, eggplant and other sorts of Asian vegetables. But even they realized, actually they didn't know a lot about pollination because it's not something that's necessarily a lot in traditional knowledge. They know of it in a holistic way, but not to really see what a bee does is something you have to pay attention to. And that was interesting to look at it with them, and then they started following bees around and seeing how interesting it was. But they realized that they needed to conserve some of that forest because that's where the bees go to nest during the dry season, and how important it is to have a mixture between agriculture and natural areas to kind of conserve the sustainability. So I worked with many partners in Kenya, and then several partners. We set up a kind of network in South Africa, Ghana, Kenya particularly, and started this African Pollinator Initiative. And at that time, the global community in the Convention on Biodiversity was recognizing the importance of agricultural biodiversity, which wasn't a part of the mandate of the Convention on Biodiversity when it first set out. But a number of developing countries said, if you want to make this relevant to us, you've got to consider agricultural biodiversity. It has to be really relevant to our livelihoods. And so they did adopt a program, and they particularly pinpointed crop biodiversity, which is all the genetic seeds and livestock diversity that's important, but also soil biodiversity and pollination.
Let me ask, I'm just curious. So when you said they weren't looking at agricultural biodiversity, this was a government program, an academic program to look at biodiversity in a natural system?
So it wasn't a government program, it's an intergovernmental program. It's the United Nations.
Okay.
And when the members of the Convention on Biodiversity get together, which they do every 2 years, they set priorities that they then ask all their member countries to listen to and develop programs to conserve, say. So endangered species, forests, various topics had come up, and the countries had adopted programs to conserve their forests. Not always effective, but at least it's a global recognition of how important these things are. And agricultural biodiversity wasn't part of that to begin with. And so this is in a discussion among member countries.
I'm just curious where this came from. This was from a group of ecologists who said, we're getting concerned about the destruction of nature and the subsequent loss of biodiversity?
Yeah, I suppose the pressure came from that and from citizen groups, but it came out of the very first Earth Summit in, was it 1992, where a lot of the UN initiatives and the Convention on Biodiversity, Convention on Desertification came from.
Okay.
So it's been around for a long time. And it was probably a lot of scientists, but it was also a lot of, certainly with agricultural biodiversity, it's been a lot of grassroots groups which have said, this is really important, more than their own government may recognize. So it has been a way for them to pressure their own governments.
Right.
Yeah.
I can imagine that governments are often not considering this to be significant. They're looking at a much shorter time scale.
Exactly. Yeah. So from there, the UN Convention on Biodiversity asked the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, to develop a program on pollination. And so they asked me to coordinate that. So I moved from Kenya to Rome and coordinated that program. I was there for 11 years.
In Rome?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And it was, it started out on pollination and working specifically in Nepal, Brazil, Pakistan, India, Kenya, Ghana, and South Africa. But over time, and working with my fantastic partners in these countries, we could do a lot of things. We could do a lot of sort of helping farmers to realize the importance of pollination, addressing pesticide policy and various things that impact pollinators. But at the end of the day, farmers don't just manage pollination. It's a holistic, they manage the whole system, and they wouldn't do just one thing for pollination. It has to fit into their farming system. And so we really focused on more holistic approaches like agroecology. And we did have, at the time, when I first came to FAO, you couldn't even talk about agroecology. It was sort of verboten. And there were a number of countries which were really opposed to it. But we had an executive director that was from director general, sorry, that was from Brazil. And Brazilians understand agroecology. He was very political. He understood conventional agriculture and agroecology. So he actually brought us into his office and said, go for it. I'm going to open the door for you to really pursue this as something that could be on the agenda, where we would be advising governments to go down this route, where we have been telling them not to.
So probably most people in America, certainly most people outside of academia, don't know much about agroecology. It's much bigger in the rest of the world.
It is much more, and it really was, it really developed out of indigenous practices in many countries. India has a long history of composting and how to work with working with nature to sustain production. Brazil has a long history in agroecological practices. But we were, and we didn't want to say, oh, FAO just discovered agroecology, because we didn't. It's very vibrant in many parts of the world. We could have a couple of symposiums where we would invite people to come to it, and they were completely unlike other symposium at FAO, because we had all these dynamic women from West Africa, and people would stand up and clap, which you don't do in a UN meeting. It was great fun. But we were asked, the first thing the member countries ask you is, what is agroecology? And we were kind of reluctant to come up with it's always, a definition is so difficult. And I'm sure you get into this a bit with real organics and organics. Like, are you saying what's in and what's out? Where do you draw the line on some things which are on a gradient that you need to maybe be encouraging progress along that gradient?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
It was interesting. Of course, organic came from the agroecology of India. Directly.
Yeah.
And Howard brought it back to England, and from there it went out to Europe and to the United States, and then back to India, which is kind of a fascinating,
really interesting,
loop. But the idea of defining it as in terms of whether this practice or that practice, or this material or that material, I think there was considerable doubt amongst the organic pioneers that was possible.
Yeah.
And I think Howard and I think Yves Balfour both didn't think it was possible, even though I think Yves Balfour's work kind of led directly to the Soil Association and the first standards.
Yeah.
So there were reasons for defining it, as it turns out.
Yeah.
And there was an understanding that we'll never get it exactly right.
Right.
But we can get it approximately right.
Yeah.
In a way that's very valuable.
Yeah, and as standards, which often are aspirational,
Yes.
whether you're actually there. But we ended up at FAO and a lot of agroecology pioneers have also talked more or less about principles rather than criteria. So we did work with a big group of people, big consultation, to identify 10 principles of agroecology. And I think that's been really helpful, because it's been to say that you can't cherry pick. You can't just pick this practice or that practice. You need to have these all together. And 5 of them are biological, physical or biological, and 5 of them are social. And it's the social ones that many governments just, they cringe at. They just don't really want to deal with sort of equity and justice issues. But if you remove that, you're not dealing with agroecology.
Yes.
So it's really, I think it's been very helpful to have an integrated set of principles.
When I talked with Miguel Altieri about this, he said that he was describing those principles. And I said, well, Miguel, that's all organic. We are the same.
Yeah.
He said, yes, but politically we're not.
Yeah.
And I said, okay, let's talk about that. Because actually, real organic is, in my mind, returning to the roots of the organic movement, which was about political stuff too, for sure.
Yeah.
So could you talk about what those the biological principles? Go ahead.
Well, they're ones that I think everyone knows pretty well. I don't have the list with me now, but it's basically about recycling, using pest control measures that respect nature, biological control, crop diversity, all around diversity in the system, and using nature in every way that you can. I think we don't even know how much nature can help us. We're just learning about it now, underground and above ground. So those are ones I think they're very much taken up in organic principles as well. The more social ones are and organic and real organic have paid attention to this for sure. It had been food traditions, circular economies, justice justice in agriculture, and there's two others which will come to me soon. But it's around really those whole issues of equity and justice and respect for indigenous populations and knowledge. One of them is around forms of knowledge. It's respecting the diversity in forms of knowledge, which I think is a really key one.
Yeah.
And some of the things we've been able to do, I was sort of put out to pasture by FAO at the age of 62, because that's the UN's retirement age, which seems quite young.
Quite young.
Yeah, really. I look back on it. But they recycle you. So, they brought me back as a consultant for some measures. Yeah. And one of them that I really liked a lot was developing, they haven't really used it yet, but developing a guidebook to farmer researcher initiatives, respecting farmers as researchers, because they're researching all the time, and respect them. And if researchers want to develop research agendas, ask the farmers first, rather than developing their agenda and then going to the farmers and telling them what they need to do, because that form of knowledge is really formidable. And it's very place-based. If you talk to many farmers in the same place, they're dealing with the same issues, but they haven't really been encouraged to share their knowledge or to have their knowledge respected.
Yeah. As part of it, is there any conversation about decentralizing power, decentralizing the economy, as opposed to consolidating, which is the major trend we see in everything, but certainly in all agriculture, in the whole food system?
Yeah. I mean, circular economies, trying to develop ways that things stay within a region is part of that. And I think there may be more. I haven't looked at it recently where you could pull that more out, but that definitely is the one that governments don't want to emphasize too much.
No.
Yeah,
No.
but it's a really, really valid one.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to see where people have gained some traction with that.
Yeah, when I started in all this, I really thought we were talking about a small regulatory failure in the USDA.
Yeah.
And I've discovered we're actually talking about democracy.
Right. Yeah.
And we're talking about the consolidation of power into the hands of a few, and they use that power to rewrite the rules.
Yeah.
So it got so much bigger than I anticipated.
Yeah.
But here we are.
Yeah, here we are. Yeah. But on the other hand, I mean, I think, the consolidation comes from a lot from the input companies. And, we know, we lived 25 years in Africa. We know how they're everywhere, and able to, convince farmers to take the money they'd saved for school fees, but end up paying it for inputs or so. But the agroecological alternative is, as we talked about with biocontrol, is a sustainable alternative to that doesn't have to involve a lot of cash exchanges. It's a way of working. So the ammunition on the other side, if it's allowed, I think can be quite tremendous.
What do you mean by
to be able to use natural processes rather than be using purchased inputs?
Yeah. So let's talk about, you said, well, of course we know what's happening in Africa, but of course most of the people listening to this don't know what's happening in Africa. So I've never been to Africa, and I know now a few African farmers through this connected world of ours. But could you tell us what is happening in Africa? It's a big place.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be the spokesperson to speak really broadly. I think you've probably interviewed Million Belay.
From your experience.
Yeah. No, but there are some people who really have got some incredible networks among farmers.
I will try and search them out in the future, but from your experience now.
Yeah, so I can speak I really have worked a lot in the field in Kenya and Ghana, I would say. And I think, so there's a lot of issues with farmers really having declining productivity. The more they've put in inputs, the less they're getting out of it. And then the farms are becoming smaller and smaller. So there's a lot of tension in agriculture.
When you say putting in inputs, because not everybody knows what that means.
Okay, sorry, fertilizer.
Chemical fertilizers.
Chemical fertilizer and pesticides. And the pesticides are the ones that concern me the most, I think. I mean, certainly from the standpoint of how it impacts pollinators, but as well, it preys so much on the anxiety of farmers that they're going to lose their whole crop if they don't spray more pesticides. And so the marketing is quite strong to farmers. But there are some really excellent initiatives that have worked with community groups and farmers who've taken matters more into their own hands. And I see them as sort of lighthouses that really provide a lot of hope and example to farmers. And you can find quite a few of these, I think. So I don't think it's the battle is not at all lost. I think it's really one that can go in the right direction. But at the same time, you've got a lot of imports. A lot of people are moving to the cities, depending more on imported food, less on beans, which is a real mainstay of nutrition and restoring soil fertility. So you've got another dynamic to deal with greater urbanization.
Okay, you used the language, this is a battle that we could still win.
Yeah.
And that's the language that Tim Wise used last week. His book talks about the battle for the future of food.
Yeah.
Can you tell me what that looks like to you, and like who are we fighting against? How did this get to be a battle?
Yeah, and the more that you can work with farmers and farmer communities, the more that they can build their own structures. It's not a battle then. I mean, they're really building their own strength. I have a good colleague who was part of our agroecology symposium in Zimbabwe who did some really nice research showing that the more you have these sort of platforms where farmers are sharing information among themselves, the stronger that is. And also the more they're able to increase their incomes and be able to have more outreach to their communities and set up more social welfare structures. So defeating, I guess, in a sense, defeating the conventional trend to not have farmers talk to each other and to network with each other. I think they used to more in the past. But the more that you find ways that they are able to build their own networks, I think really can strengthen how they would go going forward. And it's hard. I think it's very hard. I have a colleague of mine who now runs, I think the largest organic market in Nairobi. And he's not very fond of certification because certification is prone to a lot of corruption in Kenya. He himself is an organic farmer and he doesn't certify himself because he says the certifiers only asked him to pay a large amount of money each year and never came to his farm and really weren't trying to move this forward. So he's not keen on certification. The farmers in the organic market tend to say we're organic, but they're not. There's no real proof of it. And there's suspicion among the people who buy there. And I was speaking with him a little bit about participatory guarantee schemes, which I don't know if you've interacted with them, but I find them really interesting because it's peer certification. It means that they have to cooperate with each other. And my colleague said, oh, these farmers here in this market, they're very suspicious of each other also. They don't tend not to help each other. But if that was part of their, building their network and the way that they outreach to improve their standing within the community, I think it could be quite strong.
Yeah. Of course, that's how it used to be here.
Yeah.
I mean, I was talking with Judith this morning, and when organic certification began in California by CCOF, which they had started, it was farmers inspecting farmers.
Yeah.
And, and I know that there are problems with that, but I also know there are problems with the alternatives.
Yeah.
So we try and figure out what might work the best.
And with the real organic, it is pure certification.
No, we don't inspect so that people go through their USDA inspection.
Yeah.
And then we actually do an on-site inspection at least once every 5 years. And they do an annual update on their paperwork. So, and that's done by a paid staff.
Yeah. Okay.
Although they're wonderful.
Yeah.
And they know,
really committed.
They understand farming. They're very committed.
Yeah.
And they travel around, and that people are usually pretty happy to see them.
Yeah. No, that's great.
It's not like the sometimes degrading experience.
Yes. Yeah. It's a lot of suspicion.
Yeah. So good. So in Africa, how did there are a lot of chemicals being used?
That was the other part I would say is that yes, and a lot of people say, oh, smallholder farmers in Africa, they're de facto organic. They're not. I mean, they have a lot of pressure on them to use chemicals and this fear factor.
And where does that pressure come from?
from the salesman. So the salesmen they're out there, in the smallest community, and they will say, you can lose your crop completely, and the pesticides are called. They have all these words like Samson, and strongman kind of words are the title of the pesticides. So they get quite influenced by that. They don't want to lose their whole crop when it's a rather small farm.
Right.
Yeah. So it takes a lot to stand up against that.
I'm just curious how it got so strong. Was this just a market capitalism at work, or was this game being rigged in some way? Is there government support for those companies that are selling chemicals?
I don't actually know for sure. I kind of think there may be, but I think it was. I think the companies themselves, the Yara and the pesticide companies, they've turned to Africa as their next big frontier. They really see that as where they're going to get recurrent customers buying every year. So they're focusing a lot of their marketing on Africa.
Okay.
Now, my organization, FAO, has there's been a lot of publicity lately about locust control in Africa, and when locusts build up their population, they swarm, and then they can be extremely devastating to fields. And unfortunately, FAO has been really, really roundly criticized because they work with the government quite a bit. They provide pesticides for the government to spray against the locust. And most of those chemicals don't go to the locust. They're sold on the market. There's government officials who can make money off of it. And they're very toxic pesticides. They're ones which are banned in Europe often, and they should not be there at all to begin with. And then there's a good article that just came out in Grist just a couple of days ago and there's photographs of, young teenagers mixing the chemicals with their hands, which they should not be doing at all. So there is definitely government involvement. When pesticides go through the government, they can sell it on the open market. Corrupt individuals in the government can sell it and make money from it. Yeah. And that's happened all over Africa.
Yeah. A little bit the Wild West.
Yeah. So unfortunate, really.
And I have to ask, what about the Green Revolution coming to Africa?
Yeah, it's not been a success at all. And I think early on, the Green Revolution is linked to this CG system that we've talked about with, began in Simet in Mexico with Miracle Wheat and Miracle Maize and Miracle Rice in Erie. And the thought was that you could replicate this somehow in Africa, but it really has not worked out. And I think there's been kind of an early realization that intensifying agriculture in Africa just doesn't work. It just doesn't work. You've got many, many smallholders, and even when people have been able to buy large farms, it has not turned out to be sustainable. So they did set up a couple of centers in Africa that were meant to be looking at the system rather than a particular crop. And the one that Hans and I were both stationed in, IITA, the International Institute of Tropical Agriculture, was meant to be a systems approach. But there's not a lot of, the people who came there were agronomists who are not really trained in, say, social studies. I mean, I remember I was doing my work with farmers on their practices about conserving trees. And the social scientists at IITA would go up to the fence and watch the farmers outside of the fence rather than talking to them. They just weren't accustomed to working with people. So they haven't shown a lot of strength in taking a social approach. There is IITA and there's CIAT in Colombia, but I wouldn't say that they're the real, bright lights in taking a social lens on how you can support a more sustainable agriculture. And it simply hasn't worked. There is a very good study that looked at over 116 countries over a 25-year range, looking at what were the practices introduced that did the most to address hunger, since hunger is basically what we're talking about here. And out of that study, they found that the number one measure was water and sanitation. It wasn't miracle seeds, fertilizer, anything like that. The number one was water and sanitation, people having access to good water and good sanitation. And the second one was female empowerment. And both of those are social entities, that needed to be provided by local governments or local institutions. So why are we spending so much money on miracle seeds when actually the solutions are somewhere else?
Tim Wise suggested that even in the places where green revolution has been more successful, it was the bringing in irrigation systems, not the chemicals, not the seeds.
Yeah, right, exactly.
It was like, yeah, things do grow much better if you have access to reliable water source.
Right, yeah. But it's also people's attitude and their feeling about what they're doing. So we had, when I was after I left FAO, then it was sort of taken up, and it was taken up by this Committee on World Food Security, which is a really good committee. It's through many agencies, and they identify certain areas they should explore more. So they chose agroecology as their focal area. The countries who are opposed to agroecology insisted that it be agroecology and other innovations. And there was a panel of 10 of us on this high-level panel. And it was totally pro bono, but we had a little bit of funding to fund studies that would supplement what we were doing. So I was coordinating a study on food sovereignty and food security. So food sovereignty means that people have choices over what they can do, what kind of food they're going to eat, what kind of food they're going to grow, that they have. It's a question of the power and how they have that in their hands versus having it being told to them. And we could show, it was a meta-analysis, researching all sorts of documents, but that just food security programs without a food sovereignty emphasis or support were not successful. Food sovereignty needed to be a part of it.
Mm-hmm. So if it was just food security, meaning that you have a guarantee, basically a system where you feel confident that you will eat tomorrow as well as today.
Yeah, or that you're increasing yields, which doesn't necessarily mean that goes to address hunger, but you have greater yield.
Okay, that isn't quite food security, is it?
No, it isn't, but it's often taken as food security.
It is. It's
not quite right.
Assumed it is, but let's look at that assumption. What does that mean, greater yields? Like, why isn't that food security? It seems like, great, we're growing more food.
Yeah, no, it would seem, but greater yields means, probably, it means that larger farmers are able to consolidate and use some measures to produce things more intensely, and that doesn't go to the local community, that goes out to market somewhere. So it's not the community necessarily that benefits. We did a study in Senegal about rice, and the investors who wanted to come in and fund these big schemes of irrigation schemes with really intensive rice to address food security in Senegal. Senegal really depends on imported rice a lot. And the alternative to that would be to have small community-run schemes. I mean, you still need irrigation with rice, but to have community-run mills where the byproducts could go to feed animals and they would be selling within their community. And that would address food security. But simply having intensive rice production is not a direct link to food security.
Because it might be that food just gets exported.
Or goes
and the money gets exported from the community.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, everything becomes an export.
Yeah, so those are the circular economies that you want to try and find ways to support.
These are big challenges.
They are. They are big challenges. Yeah.
I see it as a battle. So you said all is not lost, that you have seen successes in creating an alternative to that export economy, consolidation of money and power. So could you talk a little bit about that? What does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the successes become very, I wouldn't say personal, but I do believe that in every farming community, you always find these incredible, innovative farmers who know how to work with the system, and they know nature, they know how to appreciate it, and they're able to find ways that is not the conventional way. So being able to find them, support them, help them to become teachers to more of the community, where I've seen that happen, it's been quite dramatic, I think. We talked a little bit about Nepal, and there's a farmer in the area I worked in Nepal he was an organic farmer where there weren't many, I think there are more now, but there weren't many organic farmers at the time. And he he was sort of laughed at by his community, and he eventually set up a network, but it was all women. There were no men that would come over to his group, but he absolutely loved nature. He wrote all the names of birds on the side of the wall of his house, and he had all these interesting kind of ways of, he had vermiculture, but he had a lot of like mongoose who would go in and eat all of his worms at nighttime. So he set up a moat around his worms and use that water to irrigate his plants, and he was just wonderful. And he's now he set up a marketing structure where the organic food is sold in Kathmandu, and has brought in many farmers from many different places, but still following his small model. And he's such an inspiration, to talk to him. And he has men; it's not just women who are following him.
That's great, and it works.
And it works. And when people see that. Farmers, they know when something works. Right. So, finding, we've had a long history in agriculture of having demonstration sites, which tend to be really sterile. It tends to be, the University of California has a number of demonstration farms, and the International Agricultural Research will have these days when they invite people to come for demonstrations, and it just doesn't, I don't think it convinces too many people, because you need to see farmers and families and how their children are interacting with the whole system, and more vibrant forms of demonstration.
So one of the farmers that Tim Wise talked to, I think in Africa, said they call it climate smart agriculture. I call it climate dumb agriculture.
Yeah, I do too.
So can we talk about why that is dumb? This is so confusing, isn't it, Barbara?
Oh, it is very confusing, and
we see these people who are very smart, and they come up with these very systems. Many people working on them.
Yeah. And
we look at it, and it kind of works, and then it also really kind of doesn't work.
Yeah. No, it's very much in the model of. So this was kind of an alternative. Maybe I don't know when it really. The verbiage came out, but FAO has promoted climate smart agriculture. At the same time, they're promoting agroecology, and we've had a few kind of in-depth kind of considerations of how they differ, and it's pretty clear how they differ. I think. I mean, the climate smart is very much about the physical and biological side of agriculture, and not addressing the social side. Really, I mean, you can give lip service to things, and that's what's unfortunate, but it really basically doesn't. So, but it has gotten a lot of support, and a lot of governments have picked it up as kind of a moniker. And this is confusing to governments. It's confusing when you have people, promoting sustainable intensification, climate smart agriculture, and agroecology all together. And it's done on purpose to obfuscate. It's if you believe, and that's what we've really tried to say, that you cannot cherry pick, that this is one way, let's not say it's one way, there's plenty of ways of addressing it, but that the social elements and the biophysical elements need to be taken together. And climate smart agriculture does not do that.
Do you think that climate smart agriculture could be successful in fact, being a positive impact on climate, or will it fail at that also?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. So the aim is, I think it's twofold. So it's adaptation, mitigation, and resilience or so. But I think adaptation, yes, I think that's good that they're addressing how farmers can try to adapt to climate change, and it's really an important consideration. But in terms of mitigation, there's been a lot that's been sold that I don't think really bears up under the pressure. And, there's been a lot of airline companies which have been investing in climate smart agriculture to offset their emissions. And that just doesn't make sense. It's, you do not offset emissions. You do not continue to pollute and offset the emissions with measures in agriculture. You need to stop polluting, basically.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And I get that, that flight is not carbon neutral.
Yeah.
But my question is, the agriculture that they are supporting, is it sequestering carbon? Oh. Is it doing the real thing? Or
I think we don't know that very well. We need a lot more understanding of that. I'm not really so sure. If you have agriculture that is putting more carbon in the soil, that's a good thing. But then you're also taking a lot of carbon out of the soil with annual crops each year. And it's not a very stable system. It's very good if you add on carbon. I'm sure you're increasing the health of those soils, but you're not building up a real repository that is going to offset emissions. Agriculture is inherently unstable. Maybe with forests and agroforestry, you have more of a chance of doing that. I would love to see more work on agroforestry systems, because I think they have a lot of benefits for people, the soil, and so forth. But not conventional agriculture, but let's say climate smart agriculture is not solely focused on agroforestry by any means.
Right. Well, as it's commonly, as the U.S. government is funding, it seems to involve a fair amount of herbicides.
Yeah, it does.
You know.
It does. And that's, something that's really considered quite okay within the system is conservation agriculture, which is basically using a lot of herbicides so it's no tilling. So you respect the soil, you let organisms grow and biodiversity, but then you apply such a lot of pesticides for clearing the land and for tilling. Here in California, since Hans and I have come back here, we've realized how much herbicide is being applied all the time, and it's being applied in the winter to clear the land. It's being applied halfway through the crop, and then it's used for harvest, which I don't know if so many people know that, but the tomatoes are sprayed with pesticides so that they ripen and they can go through with the machinery. And then, like the Caltrans, the Transportation Authority, sprays all of the roadsides, and the amount of dosing of herbicides in any environment is really a lot. And climate smart agriculture climate conservation agriculture has really promoted no-till, but no-till using herbicide. So as long as you keep those things linked, I think you can't really say that this is, I don't think that's increasing soil biodiversity as much as it should. I mean, the jury's a bit out on that. I'm not absolutely sure, but you could do so much more to increase soil biodiversity. There's a good agroecologist at UC Davis, Emily Godin, and she's done a fair amount of work at Full Belly. And she was just telling us recently that probably the best way to sequester carbon is to have animals linked into the agriculture.
Right.
And that's really interesting, I think. We're just taking us back where we used to be.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Well, Full Belly is doing all that.
Yeah.
It's beautiful.
Yeah.
Okay, there are two things that I think we do need to get back to that we skipped over a little bit. One is just talking about pollination. You were interested in pollination before most of the world was interested.
Yeah.
And now everyone is talking about it, that we're facing insect apocalypse. Could you just speak a little bit about that? Like, should people be freaked out?
Yes, I think they should. But at the same time, insects are really robust. So if you treat them well and you don't dose them with pesticides, they will come back. I don't think we have populations that have completely been eliminated. So given half a chance, I think they will come back. And one thing that I love about pollination is that they love agriculture. They come into your fields, and we've seen in Kenya and in New Jersey, there are two studies that there were more diverse and even rare pollinators in agricultural fields than in forests, because they love sun and they love flowers, and if they're not hit with pesticides, they'll come in and thrive. So yes, we should be concerned. I've seen a lot of loss of diversity here in California, and I've seen it in the countries that I've worked in. But I think they're very they're robust. They build up their populations when they can, and they will come in and come back.
So recovery is possible.
Yeah. And their diversity is really important, that you've got pollinators that fly when it's cold and pollinators when it's not too many when it's rainy, but under different circumstances they will be there. So you really want to have the diversity.
Now there's a lot of people have a basic horror of insects. They're like icky, like yes, kill them all, right? So what are they missing?
Well, the whole world, I tell you. They are so interesting. So I do give talks to my sisters' women's group and people, and I present them my favorite bee, and it's just amazing what bees do when you start looking at them a little bit more. Like there's a bee that lines it's a solitary bee, and solitary bees are just single mothers trying to support their babies, and she lines her nest with petals, like pink rose petals, just beautiful. And there's carpenter bees, which a lot of people don't really. This is what you gain when you start looking at it a little bit more. People often see carpenter bees as being a pest because they drill into wood quite a lot. And my colleagues in Kenya, the farmers there, when I told them about how good they are, they said, "Oh, no, I spray it with a can of pesticide if I can find it." But they, you just have to put some animal dung in their holes and they'll go someplace else. But they drill in, and then they have these 2 spikes on their sides so they can put the spikes out and then turn a somersault to come out of their tunnel, which I think is ingenious for, you just start looking at these worlds that are amazing.
And you just named something that was a problem for somebody and that there was a simple solution, and it didn't involve buying a product made in a factory someplace that will poison their kids as well as
yeah.
So we have a failure of imagination and of knowledge.
Yeah. So there is such a world with insects that I'm so happy to have 3 grandchildren now. We can keep indoctrinating them a little bit, and I think we did pretty well with our children because we have one that's a nematologist and one that's a mosquito biologist.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
Okay, so we still have a little bit of time left. Let's talk about true cost accounting, because you've done so much work with there. First, can you just explain what that means?
Yeah, okay. Just simply this certainly has come out of, looking at how you could operationalize agroecology, is this concept of, why are we paying more for organic and the conventional farmers who are using inputs that have a lot of health costs and other costs, why is that money not going to deal with the negative externalities of conventional agriculture? So why do organic farmers need to get certified? Shouldn't it be the conventional ones, which should be more truthful about what they're putting on and then pay for the costs of that? So the concept is that there are a lot of negative externalities from conventional agriculture, and this is more and more accepted and known. I think even our major governments that are not so much in favor of agroecology will acknowledge this, that we have a lot of soils that have been destroyed. We have a lot of health costs from our current food system. Who's paying for that? I mean, it's not the people who are benefiting from that kind of agriculture. It's the consumers and the people who cannot afford to pay for it. So this would be the idea of leveling that playing field and assigning the costs as the negative costs. But I always say this, I'm one of the people get tired of me hearing it, but let's talk about the positive costs, because agriculture done holistically and with real attention to nature has many positive benefits. So we should count those in the ledger. The farmers who are doing things right, they should be appreciated for that. So we're trying to figure out how that could be done. And so there's a number of who will do it and how will it be picked up? And the government of the Netherlands is exploring how that could be done, but it mostly has been in the private sector, which I must say, if you look back over history, a lot of measures, sometimes it has been the private sector that's been the innovators. And so, again, this is Dutch companies that I can think of. I think there's been some work in the US, but they look at their products and they give a full accounting of what the externalities would be, positive and negative, that they share with their customers. There's a store in Amsterdam that has this all on their blackboards, of whatever you may buy from them will tell you that. Is that maybe more a way that we should be going? And we think until you can have that kind of playing field, it's going to be very hard to change the whole dynamic.
So, and just to make sure that people understand, externalities means consequences.
Yeah.
Like I spilled this poison in the well, and now the well is polluted, and everyone who drinks out of it gets sick.
Yeah.
So that pollution of the well would be an externality.
No, that's right.
Yeah.
And it usually is meant for economists. They've used that term forever, and it means things that are not accounted for.
Yeah.
So it doesn't mean that there isn't a cost, but it's just not accounted for.
Not accounted for.
Yeah.
And these are literal costs. These are real costs that somebody will have to pay for,
yes,
maybe with their lives.
Yes. No, it's not an abstract concept at all.
Yeah. And some of it is very real that, well, yes, nobody paid for it at the cash register, but
somebody's going to pay for it.
Somebody's going to the hospital and there are going to be big medical bills because of this practice.
Yeah. Yeah. And we have taken it to be, as we've continued to explore this concept. We edited a book a couple of years ago, and we've had a group that's been working on this, and we have taken it to be throughout the food system as well. So people who look at the costs of many of the food workers, the food system workers, that's a cost also, that they deliver us really cheap food. It's not good for our health, but they also are really poorly compensated, having to work when they're sick because they can't afford a day off. It's cost throughout the food system.
Yeah. So the question is, as people, I think there is a growing awareness of this. Mm-hmm. So we see that it's far from universal, but
yeah,
people are starting to understand. I don't know where it started. I think of it as starting with Silent Spring.
Yeah, yeah.
And certainly Rachel Carson's book was this amazing moment of awakening.
Yeah.
For America.
Yeah.
To go, whoa, this is scary.
Yeah.
You know, bad things are happening, and we thought these companies were looking out for us, but they're not.
Right. Yeah.
And I think it was, in some ways, that moment was the beginning of the organic movement in American popular culture.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Yeah. But the challenge, and I'm sure you deal with this a lot with organic policy, is that, so then people say, yeah, but people can't afford it. You know, we need to have cheap food. And that's true in developing countries. That's a real political football. You know, if you were to increase the price of food, you'd have riots, and you would, most likely. Yeah. So we need to rethink the whole system altogether. And I think we should not use cheap food, as being a welfare device. And I think we need to address that everybody needs to eat well. And that is it's a social good. It's a common good that we should be addressing. John Eichert is he in Missouri or Nebraska?
I think he's in Missouri.
He talks about food as being a public utility.
Yeah.
And I really like that concept. I think we need to talk about it a lot more and get our heads around it and see how that works. And I also think a fair amount about, what are we asking people to do? You know, I like to cook, so that's fine. I like to cook with raw ingredients. But a lot of people either don't like to cook, or they don't have the time, or they don't have a kitchen to cook in. And we need to think more about how good food can be delivered to everybody, and not have this be something only for those who can afford it. I'm working a little bit with somebody here in California on MICO, the Micro Enterprise Home Kitchen Opportunity, with the idea that people in their homes could have a home kitchen that would serve meals to about 25 people a night, and within their neighborhood. And it hasn't been adopted in YOLO, but it's been adopted in a number of counties in California. The county has to buy in on it.
So they're basically allowing them to operate as a small restaurant.
Yeah. And it tends to be immigrant families that are interested in doing this.
Yeah.
And they're serving their own food to their own population.
Yeah.
And home cooked.
Yeah.
So things like that, I think it has to be part of the equation.
Yeah, sounds great. That question of the cost of food being cheap, Michael Pollan was eloquent about that when I talked with him, saying cheap food is a way of making it. I don't want to misspeak for Michael, so I'll just say cheap food is a way of making it that people don't notice or mind so much that they're being severely underpaid. You know, that our actual pay scale for the lower paid jobs has barely gone up compared to inflation since 1960.
Yeah, amazing. Huh?
And that if we had tracked inflation, then minimum wage would be at like $26 or something.
Yeah.
And one of the ways that the government gets away with not having food riots is to have cheap food.
Yeah.
Because you can still afford cheap food, maybe. It's not very good food.
Yeah.
And that's of course lost out of the equation.
Yeah. And then all the health impacts of, and I think people are understanding more and more how processed food is really no food, or you're not getting the nutrients that you need. And the contribution to obesity is something that I think people are getting pretty concerned about that. It's just so prevalent that obviously our food system is not delivering health.
It's interesting always for me to see old still photographs of like people in the 1940s, the
Mm.
1930s, the 1920s, they're all so lean.
Yeah, obviously it wasn't an issue.
It's just
Yeah.
lean. And I think even in 1960, as a country, we were much, much thinner, and then something happened.
Yeah, yeah. But a lot of that food is really attractive to people. It's very palatable, and I think they've learned to put chemicals in it that make it really palatable.
Yeah.
And you kind of have to develop another tongue.
Yeah.
Children need to. And
Yeah.
that's not easy.
No.
Yeah.
No, it's not easy, and it's a whole system.
Yeah.
And our kids are in it, and it's hard for a parent to cope with it. It's very hard for a kid.
Yeah.
So what does it take for true cost accounting to become part of who we are, part of how we shop? One interesting question is, you described it like with the store in the Netherlands or whatever,
Yeah.
and they have the kind of score
Yeah.
for each product. Good. That's let the consumer make the decision.
Yeah.
And I say consumer knowingly. I normally would call them eaters, but
Yeah.
we're talking about each of us. Are we a citizen or are we a consumer? And the government and the companies would like us to be consumers.
Yeah. No,
To
that's-
think of
yeah.
ourselves as consumers.
Yeah. So that is the solution that targets the consumer, the individual. And we were talking about that earlier, and I really believe that in so many of our environmental problems, we've been led to believe that it's because of you, the individual, and how they consume. Whereas actually it's much more of a social and economic issue with plastics. Listening to this podcast the other day, which says that, it's really not people recycling their plastic bottle. That's good. It's very helpful. But that is not the major contribution to plastics in the ocean and plastics in the environment. It's the plastic in agriculture and the plastics in factories. So it's all what you're told, to recycle. You can feel good about it, but that's not the major way that we're going to reduce plastic in the ocean, for example. No, you're right. I think although it's been companies to kind of see this on the horizon, these Dutch companies, which are often they're very well run and careful and think about these things. But at the end of the day, it would be government that needs to think about the social good of having true cost accounting. And I'd like to see that. There's been a few symposium we've had on true cost accounting, trying to see if it can be taken up. I don't know. It's a hard one, I think, because it's the agroecologists are not necessarily where they're focusing so much. We had this big UN food system summit last year that I was really opposed to. And they did adopt true cost. They had more of the private sector involved in it, and they did really adopt true cost accounting. So maybe I should be less anti and, say good for you, and hope that may bring the discussion about more. I don't know. I'm getting old, I guess.
Well, I don't think any of us see a clear path towards the world we want.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of us do want things to be different than they are.
Yeah.
I'm really struck by, we were talking about Stuart Hill,
Mm-hmm.
and that so much of the change that needs to happen isn't ultimately regulatory. It's inside ourselves.
Yeah.
It's not even, well, what do you buy or what do you not buy? It's just what are our values,
Yeah.
and then can we live them?
Yeah.
And of course, if we can do that, then government does change.
Yeah, it does. And it would be, really need to think out more how we help educate our children to these social values and how we have them be more than an individual value. It's a shared value.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we're at our time. Is there
Great.
any last thing that you would love to say that you go, I just wanted to say?
Yeah, no, I think we touched on it. I did hope we'd talk about true cost accounting and MECOs. Those are two things I'm kind of, landscape, groundwater management, but that's another area.
Okay. Well, I'll be talking to Daniel O'Connell next Sunday, so I think we'll get into that.
Great. Okay,
Yeah,
good.
yeah, good.
Yeah.
All right.
Great.
Barbara, thank you so much.
Well, thank you. It's always good to talk with you.
Thank you for listening to the Real Organic Podcast. Our movement is growing because you're subscribing and sharing these podcasts with your friends. So keep it up and leave us a rating and a review as well so that others can help them find this podcast. A video version of this interview is on our newly designed website, realorganicproject.org, and on our YouTube channel. And you can join us every Thursday for a new episode featuring voices from the organic movement. See you next time.